Imagine controlling 9 out of every 10 barrels of oil refined in the most powerful industrial nation on Earth. Not owning a big share, not being the market leader, controlling 90%. The other 10% existing only because you decided to tolerate it. That is what John D. Rockefeller achieved before his 40th birthday. And here is what makes it truly extraordinary. He did not do it by being the biggest. He did it by building a system, a legal structure so innovative, so perfectly designed, and so far ahead of its time that the United States government spent 30 years trying to understand it well enough to stop it. That system was called the Standard Oil Trust, and the principles behind it are still being used by the wealthiest people and most powerful corporations in the world today. By the end of this episode, you will understand exactly how it worked and what it means for anyone building serious wealth right now. This is the Rockefeller Code. After the Cleveland Massacre of 1872, Rockefeller did not slow down. He accelerated. The acquisition of 22 competitors in 6 weeks had given him something more valuable than their refineries. It had given him a template. He now knew exactly how to approach a competitor. He knew the psychology. He knew the offer structure. He knew the timing. And he took that template and applied it city by city across the entire American oil industry. By January 1871, Standard Oil had achieved a 10% market share, making it the largest player in the industry. By 1873, it had 1/3 of the market share, refining 10,000 barrels a day. By the end of the decade, it had achieved a 90% market share, 10% to 90% in less than a decade, while also cutting the price of kerosene for ordinary American consumers from 26 cents per gallon down to 8 cents per gallon. He was simultaneously building the most dominant monopoly in American history and making his product cheaper for the people buying it. By 1879, Standard Oil did about 90% of the refining in the United States, with almost 70% being exported overseas. The business had become so large and so complex that Rockefeller only dealt with the major problems and the larger outlines of his affairs. Rockefeller was only 40 years old. 40 years old, controlling 90% of American oil, exporting 70% of it to the world, and he was just getting started. But by the early 1880s, Rockefeller faced a problem that success itself had created. Standard Oil was operating in dozens of states. Each state had its own laws. And those laws were very clear. A company incorporated in Ohio could not legally own companies in other states. His empire was growing faster than the legal structures of the time could contain. He had acquired companies everywhere. He controlled pipelines, transportation, distribution, and refining across the entire country. But legally, on paper, it was a mess. A collection of separate state companies with tangled ownership structures that were increasingly difficult to manage and increasingly vulnerable to legal challenge. Most businessmen of his era would have slowed down, would have consolidated into one state, would have accepted the legal limitations of the time as simply the rules of the game. Rockefeller hired a lawyer and invented a new rule. On January 2nd, 1882, New Year's Day, Rockefeller and his associates signed a document that changed the history of American business forever. It was called the Standard Oil Trust Agreement. By a secret agreement of 1882, all the existing 37 stockholders in the various enterprises of refining, piping, buying, and selling oil conveyed their shares in trust to 9 trustees, John and William Rockefeller, and 7 of their closest associates. Here is how the trust worked and why it was a stroke of genius. The shareholders of 40 different state-based companies transferred their stock to a single board of 9 trustees led by Rockefeller. In exchange, the shareholders received trust certificates which paid dividends based on the pooled profits of the entire enterprise. This innovative arrangement bypassed state laws that restricted one company from owning stock in another, allowing the trustees to manage the entire empire as a single cohesive unit. Think about what this means. 40 separate companies operating in dozens of states, legally independent, complying with every state law, but actually controlled by 9 people sitting in one room in New York City. The companies appeared to be competitors. They had different names, different offices, different employees. But every significant decision, pricing, acquisition, expansion, flowed from the same 9 trustees, from the same mind. By the trust agreement, companies could be purchased, created, dissolved, merged, or divided. Eventually, the trustees governed some 40 corporations, of which 14 were wholly owned. It was the first time in American history that anyone had built a structure capable of managing a nationwide industrial empire while remaining legally compliant in every individual state. Samuel Dodd, Rockefeller's lawyer, had essentially invented a new form of corporate organization, the trust structure that every major corporation in the world uses today traces its legal lineage directly to that January 2nd document. The government's response was inevitable and slow, painfully slow for Rockefeller's competitors. In 1890, Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, new legislation specifically designed to break up trusts like Standard Oil. But even then, it took another 21 years of legal battles before the Supreme Court finally ordered Standard Oil dissolved. In 1911, the Supreme Court ruled that Standard Oil violated antitrust law and ordered it broken into 34 separate independent companies. Journalists celebrated, competitors cheered. The great monopoly was finally destroyed, and Rockefeller, who owned shares in every single one of those 34 companies, watched his personal net worth roughly double almost overnight. Because here's what nobody had anticipated. The 34 companies that emerged from Standard Oil's breakup included what would eventually become ExxonMobil, Chevron, BP America, and dozens of other energy giants. The sum of the parts was worth dramatically more than the whole had been, and Rockefeller held shares in all of them. The government had tried to destroy him. It made him the wealthiest human being in history. So, what is the actual wealth principle behind the trust structure? Because it was not just a legal workaround. It was a fundamentally different way of thinking about ownership and control. Most people, when they build something, think about ownership as a simple equation. I own the thing. The thing is worth X. My wealth equals X. Rockefeller thought completely differently. He separated ownership from control. He understood that you do not need to own 100% of something to control it completely. And controlling something completely, setting its prices, its strategy, its acquisitions, is where the real power lives. The trust gave 9 people control over 40 companies. Not ownership, control. The distinction is everything, because control scales infinitely. Ownership is always limited by capital. Control is limited only by structure and strategy. This is precisely how Warren Buffett built Berkshire Hathaway, controlling dozens of independent companies through a central holding structure without owning 100% of any of them. It is how the Rockefeller family still manages its wealth across hundreds of heirs and dozens of entities today. It is how every major private equity firm operates, controlling companies far larger than the capital they actually deploy. The trust is dead. The principle is everywhere. In your own wealth building, the principle of separating ownership from control applies at every level. A small business owner who creates a holding company structure protects assets while maintaining control across multiple entities. An investor who understands voting shares versus economic shares can maintain control of a company while distributing ownership to investors. A real estate investor who uses LLC structures controls properties while limiting personal liability. The specific tools change. The principle is identical to what Rockefeller and his lawyer Samuel Dodd invented on January 2nd, 1882. Structure your control. Distribute your ownership. Never confuse the two. John D. Rockefeller turned 40 years old, controlling 90% of American oil. He did it not by being the strongest or the most ruthless, though he was both. He did it by building systems that worked while he slept, acquired while he planned, and compounded while the world tried to catch up. The trust was broken up in 1911. The companies it created still dominate global energy today. The wealth it generated still flows through the Rockefeller family in the 21st century. And the structural principles behind it still sit at the foundation of every serious wealth-building operation in the world. Build the system. Control the system. Let the system work. That is the code. This is the Rockefeller Code.